in this video, I want to continue to talk about the conversation that we've been having about settler colonialism and the worker strike. This has been a really interesting set of conversations for me to talk about, because I definitely think that there are a lot of really interesting ways that the question of settler colonialism really bears on just thinking about the worker strike in general, and thinking about the way that it changes the question of how states relate to the recognition of various types of movements and the right to kind of like strike in the first place. And so I definitely think there are a lot of really interesting places to kind of talk about how various arguments in the realm of settler colonialism kind of interact with various types of arguments that show up in the worker strike resolution. In the last video that I did, that I definitely think that you should watch to get the context of this video, I talked about what it would mean to kind of think about some of the priorities when answering settler colonialism arguments that are presented on the affirmative, and what negative teams should kind of be focusing on in terms of how they can really take these affirmatives apart and the pieces that they should be pushing in order to make their strategies work. I want to continue with that in this video, but I definitely think it's important to tune into things like the intro to the worker strike and settler colonialism set of videos, because I think it kind of lays out what I think some of the primary like framings of what these affirmatives will look like. And I think that that's like really important in terms of understanding what the negative teams will be responding to, and how they'll kind of be thinking about what responses are most important when these criticism or these affirmatives are kind of made in this way. And so I think that being able to kind of understand the full picture of what types of affirmatives I'm specifically speaking out about responding to is definitely helpful in order to have the idea for what I'll be talking about in this video when I speak more about responding to these affirmatives from the lens of criticism, counterplans, and disads. So from the lens of criticisms, I definitely feel like there are diverse options that criticisms have against a critique like this, because I feel like there are definitely lots of ways that the normative arguments that teams will read against a team that's reading settler colonialism from a critical perspective definitely don't have to change that much, but I think it's really a question of your application to them and your ability to create a world where you can comfortably make link arguments without feeling like they're kind of like really minute differences, or that they aren't really impacted well enough out to really get a judge's ballot, which I think is really the biggest kind of barrier when affirmatives like don't really have to like answer the resolution on terms of like what methods they produce otherwise, which is really unique to this specific type of resolution. So I think that it's kind of like an interesting way to think about like what the burdens and processes should be. I think that as a critical team, the thing that I would be focusing most on is how can you like just generate as much competition as possible, and how can you make it easy for judges to understand where the lines are drawn between your strategies and their, because I think the immediate reaction from settler colonialism teams, as it is with a lot of critical teams in these cases, is figure out ways to get access to a permutation debate that makes their lives a lot easier. And so I think that being able to kind of like stop that strategy as early on as possible is really helpful for you. The first way I would say to do that is by setting up a really strong framework argument that pinpoints to the judge what portion of the affirmative you're taking problem with, and why that portion is important for the way in which they're evaluating the differences in methods and what it does in terms of how they're writing their ballot. I think that this could obviously be a bunch of things depending on the criticism, but I think that my biggest advice here is just spend time I think the important advice is really spend time locking into what you think are the most important portions that you really want to take up with the negative, and being able to lock in, really spending time developing your framework arguments to really get unique net benefits that get them out of being able to like make the question whatever they want it to be. I feel like a lot of settler colonial teams, or just critical teams in general on this resolution, will try to generally have like one type of framework argument that they work themselves off of, whether they're trying to view the resolution as a kind of archival project, or whether or not they're thinking about material alternatives to like the question of the worker strike. And so I feel like you need to be able to pinpoint which kind of portion of the affirmative you want to be kind of taking your problem with, and being able to pinpoint why having a discussion on that specific purpose links to the other portion of what their affirmative is doing, and also why it kind of contributes to like the active form of violence that not only their criticism is talking about, but the additional impact comparison that you want to set up on your stuff, that I think is super important. Then I think the next question is trying to figure out how can you build things like link diversity. I feel like this is really something that develops from your ability to develop a set of examples that show off different perspectives, even if they're around a similar set of the basis for the same link arguments. Even if your link arguments even just want to take up the problematic that they're centering settler colonialism as the kind of like center for how they're thinking about like the violence and the way in which like violence is kind of like carried on through time and via like language such as genocide. I feel like that the place that you really want to be able to situate being able to make diversity is when you're able to bring examples in terms of like why that language, when that language becomes incomplete, and the various ways in which it kind of participates in acting out forms of violence. I feel like a way that teams can kind of diversify the link arguments that they're making is thinking about maybe making less link arguments in this case, and making more impact scenarios, I guess, to your link arguments that are shown through examples. So even if you have like a link argument that's just like about why the historical way in which they're reading and thinking about violence is bad, and then you want to have like historical arguments under it, the next thing that you really want to be able to do is the next thing that you really want to be able to do is kind of like bang out a lot of reasons about why all these examples kind of show independent like ways in which the 1AC kind of like participates in and triggers these impact scenarios, even if it's through the same link argument, because it still requires from the affirmative team a lot more detailed work to do more than just being like, this is a link to the status quo, or this just can't be the affirmative, and trying to kind of vaguely link turn it through that way, by putting more pressure on them to have like more nuanced answers to the various impact scenarios that are carried by the possibility that they do link to this argument, because then they're kind of in a position where it's like 1% link argument, or like, very low threshold for you winning that link argument in order for them to lose, because of how overpowering your impact debate is. I then think that when you kind of like switch maybe this over to a counterplan dissad debate, some of my advice is a little bit similar, because I also think that this debate will be small in terms of like what the possible link arguments will be, but this is another place where I think really building diverse impact arguments, even if you're going to stick with a classic impact calculus argument, is super important. Whether you want to read like your utilitarianism, or just arguments about like why we should be thinking about the material consequences of how we're relating to the world and the like resolutions that we study, it's really important for you to also be able to like tag team that with arguments about why the kind of like arguments and impacts that are triggered by the dissad or the counterplan from the affirmative kind of contribute and magnify the exact impacts that are producing things like settler colonialism and forms of like genocide or erasure, because of the ways in which those things are heavily conditioned to change the ways in which the material world is forming around us, and why the material world is also like in terms able to get worse through the kind of continuance of like systems as the way they are, which is set up uniqueness arguments for you to do things like reading the resolution back to them, making arguments just straight up about why worker strikes are important, why the right to strike is important, and why things like being able to like consider the specific legal demands and the ways in which like rights frameworks can be useful in order of making that happen is particularly useful in terms of being able to adjust those material circumstances and make like legitimate demands that open up the possibility to create other forms of kind of like coming together, or of other forms of movement making and demands that resolve more of the impacts that are latent in the 1AC. And I think that being able to kind of organize your thoughts that way can allow you to really access a diverse set of ways in order to get to the negative ballot, by allowing yourself to like win that it's not just a dissent that stands completely outside the realm of the 1AC, but that you're actively interacting with every facet of it in order to make it more competitive, which I think makes it harder for the affirmative to make like really vague or like low threshold explanation arguments in order to kind of like make it all make sense. Hopefully this video should be helpful for you, and hopefully you'll be able to tune into more videos I'll be doing talking about like this or other stuff. And yeah, thanks as always.